Hi everyone, welcome back to TechCravers. Now, I know I'm pretty late to the party, but I finally got around to testing what many people consider one of the best handhelds you can buy for under $100, the Mangmi Air X. Ever since this little thing launched, I've seen people praising it all over Reddit, Discord and YouTube. Some even go as far as calling it the new budget king. So naturally, I wanted to find out if it actually lives up to the hype, or if it's just another case of the internet getting a little carried away. I've spent the last couple of weeks using it the way I think most people actually would. I've been playing everything from Game Boy Advance to PlayStation to Dreamcast, PSP and even a bit of GameCube, while paying close attention to things that really matter: performance, comfort, build quality, and of course whether it's actually fun to use. Because let's be honest, specs only tell part of the story. A handheld can have a great chip on paper, but if the controls don't feel right, the screen isn't enjoyable or the software gets in the way, you're probably not going to keep reaching for it. So in this review I'll tell you exactly what I liked, what I didn't, and most importantly, whether the Mangmi Air X is actually worth your money in 2026. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. Lifting the lid, you're first greeted by a cardboard inserted showing the specs, the button layout and a few safety notices. One of them specifically say not to throw the battery into a fire because it may rupture. And I really can't stress this enough, if your first instinct when something catches fire is to throw the battery into it, maybe firefighting just isn't your thing. Anyway, underneath the insert you'll find a screen protector, which is always nice to see included, the handheld itself and a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. It's a pretty straightforward unboxing, but it includes everything you need to get started. So picking it up for the very first time, I have to admit that it isn't what I expected from a sub-$100 handheld. It immediately gives off a much more premium vibe than the price would suggest. The plastic has this smooth, almost soft-touched finish where there are no weird creaks or rattles, and everything feels tightly put together. It's light, but not so light that it feels cheap. It actually has a reassuring amount of heft to it. And I think that's where Mangmi has been really smart. If you only had 30 seconds with this handheld before deciding whether you wanted it or not, they've clearly spent the money on the things you're going to notice first. The fit and finish, the rounded edges, the controls and overall feel in your hands. It all creates a really solid first impression. Of course, that's with the handheld powered off. A device can feel fantastic in your hands and still fall apart once you actually start using it. But purely from a build quality perspective, if someone handed this to me without telling me the price, I honestly would have guessed it cost quite a bit more. And that's a pretty good start. The first time you power it on, you're greeted by Mangmi's setup wizard, which will walk you through all the basics. You'll choose your language, connect to your Wi-Fi, and perhaps most conveniently decide whether you want to install the recommended emulators and apps right from the start. It's a nice touch, especially if you're new to Android-based handhelds. Instead of spending your first hour hunting down emulators and getting everything set up yourself, you can be up and running with just a few taps. Of course, if you prefer doing things your own way, you can simply skip the suggested apps and install whatever emulator setup you normally use. A short while later, you'll find yourself on Android's familiar home screen, and the emulators you chose to install will gradually start appearing as they're downloaded and installed in the background. If you've used an Android device before, you'll feel right at home. And if you haven't, there's really nothing intimidating about it. Everything is laid out just as you'd expect, making it easy to jump in and start setting things up the way you like. One thing I really like is Mangmi's pre-installed frontend, simply called Game Launcher. All I had to do was insert my microSD card with my ROM collection, and within a few moments Game Launcher had scanned the card and populated my entire library. No manual setup, no pointing emulators to folders, no messing around with file paths, it just worked. Now, is it the prettiest frontend out there? Not really, but in terms of convenience, it's honestly hard to beat. Being able to go from inserting a micro SD card to actually playing games in just a couple of minutes is actually the kind of out-of-box experience I think a lot of people are looking for. That said, what you're seeing here is the stock experience. If I ended up using the Mangmi Air X as my daily handheld for several months, I'd probably switch over to something like Emulation Station. It's a bit more polished, a lot more customizable, and once you spend time setting it up, I think it's the better long-term solution. One thing worth pointing out though is that Game Launcher is configured to launch the pre-installed emulators you selected during the initial setup. So if you decide to install your own standalone emulators instead, you'll also need to update the launcher so it points to the correct apps. It's only a one-time thing, but it's good to know if you're planning on customizing your setup. Now, as for the hardware, the Mangmi Air X is powered by Qualcomm's Snapdragon 662. Now, it's definitely not the newest chip around, but for a budget Android handheld like this, it's still a very capable choice. It's paired with 4GB of LPDDR4X RAM and an Adreno 610 GPU, which, as we'll see later in the video, is enough to comfortably handle everything from classic retro systems all the way up to quite a few GameCube games. On the front there's a 5.5-inch IPS display with a resolution of 1920 by 1080. It's a sharp-looking panel with good colors, solid viewing angles and 400 nits of brightness. I never really had any issues using it indoors. Storage-wise, you get 64GB of internal eMMC storage, although chances are that you'll mainly be relying on a microSD card for your game library anyway. The handheld runs Android 14 out of the box and supports both Wi-Fi 5 and Bluetooth 5.0, making it easy to download apps, sync wireless controllers and connect a pair of Bluetooth headphones. You also get active cooling with a small internal fan, Hall effect joysticks and Hall triggers to help eliminate stick drift over time, a built-in 6-axis gyroscope for games that support motion controls, and a 5000 mAh battery that charges over USB-C at up to 15 watts. Looking purely at the spec sheet, there's really nothing that feels obviously cheap here. In fact, for a handheld in this price range, it's a surprisingly well-rounded package. Moving on to the hardware, let's start with the controls. The Hall effect sticks feel surprisingly good. They're smooth, accurate and have just the right amount of resistance. Around the base of each stick you also find customizable RGB rings, which, while they don't really add anything from a functionality standpoint, do make the handheld feel a bit more premium than its price tag would suggest. And the 4 face buttons are another highlight for me. They're nice and large with a soft, spongy rubber membrane feel that I personally really enjoy. If you're someone who prefers really clicky buttons though, these probably won't be your favorite, but for longer gaming sessions I actually found them very comfortable. The shoulder buttons and triggers are perfectly functional, although they don't quite have the same premium feel as the rest of the controls. They almost have this slightly 3D printed texture to them. It's not something that negatively affected my experience, but it's definitely one area that you can tell some compromises were made. The D-pad on the other hand is excellent. It's large, comfortable and has a really nice pivot and worked great for retro games. It's also positioned above the left analog stick, which tells you a lot about what this handheld is really designed for. If your library mainly consists of retro systems that rely on the D-pad, this layout feels very natural. That said, I never found using the left stick uncomfortable either, so it's not really something I'd consider a drawback. Flipping the handheld over, you'll find Mangmi's logo on the center along with a fairly large air intake for the active cooling system. And around the bottom edge you also find 2 downward firing speakers, a 3.5mm headphone jack, the microSD card slot and a USB-C port for charging. As for the size, the Mangmi Air X sits in a really nice middle ground. Compared to the AYN Odin 3, it's a little bit shorter, but it's almost identical in height, so it feels like a proper handheld rather than a tiny retro device. And then next to the Odin 2 Portal, the difference becomes much more obvious. The Portal's larger 7-inch display makes it noticeably bigger overall, whereas the Mangmi Air X feels much more compact and easier to throw in a bag without giving up too much screen real estate. Personally, I think the 5.5-inch form factor strikes a really nice balance between portability and comfort. It's large enough that games don't feel cramped, but still compact enough that I'd actually want to bring it with me. Now then, when it comes to actual gaming performance, I think Mangmi has done a really good job of focusing on what the hardware is actually capable of. Everything from the 8 and 16-bit systems all the way up to Dreamcast runs really well. During my testing, I played everything from Genesis and SNES to Game Boy Advance, PlayStation and Dreamcast using Mangmi's stock emulator setup. And honestly, I didn't run into any issues worth mentioning. It's a very much plug-and-play experience, which is exactly what I'd expect from a handheld in this price range. PSP is another pleasant surprise. Running games at 2x native resolution was no problem at all, and it looks fantastic on this display. Considering just how many great PSP games are out there, that's definitely a nice bonus. But once you move into PlayStation 2 territory though, things start to fall apart. Personally, I'd only recommend sticking to the lighter, less demanding PS2 titles because anything heavier quickly starts feeling sluggish, sometimes even dropping into slow motion. I'm sure you can squeeze out more performance by tweaking emulator settings, but if we're judging the out-of-box experience, PS2 isn't really where this handheld shines. The same goes for GameCube, although here I think the issue is more with the software than the hardware itself, because out of the box Mangmi uses a pretty poor RetroArch core for GameCube emulation, and honestly it's just not a great experience. Simply installing the latest Dolphin MMJ-R fork and launching my games from there instead made a huge difference. Games like Mario Kart Double Dash and The Wind Waker suddenly became very playable with only the occasional shader compilation stutter. Not every GameCube game performed that well, of course, but I also didn't tweak a single setting. I literally just switched to a better standalone emulator and hit play. So I definitely think there's more performance to unlock if you're willing to spend a little time tweaking. But even without doing any of that, I think Mangmi has targeted the right audience here. This isn't a PS2 or GameCube handheld, and it doesn't pretend to be. It's a fantastic system for everything up to Dreamcast, with some 6th generation consoles thrown in as a nice bonus if you're prepared to experiment a little. So after spending some time with the Mangmi Air X, I have to say that I'm genuinely impressed. It's not trying to be the fastest Android handheld on the market, and it certainly isn't a device I'd recommend if your main goal is PlayStation 2 or GameCube. But I also don't think that's what Mangmi set out to build. Instead, they focused on delivering a polished experience where it matters most. The build quality is great, the controls are comfortable, the display is sharp, the software setup is surprisingly beginner friendly, and everything up to Dreamcast runs exactly as you hope right out of the box. And I think that's where it's easy to lose sight of what this handheld actually costs. The Air X comes in at under $100. Sure, once you factor in shipping, you're probably looking at another 15 or 20 bucks, but even then, that's kind of crazy. Just a few years ago, handhelds in this price range struggled to run Nintendo 64 properly. Now we're talking about a device that handles everything up to Dreamcast with ease, runs PSP beautifully at higher resolutions, and can even dip its toes into PS2 and GameCube if you're willing to do a little tweaking. At the end of the day, I think the biggest compliment I can give the Air X is that I actually wanted to keep playing it after I finished testing. And honestly, that's usually a pretty good sign. So if you're looking for a well-built Android handheld for retro gaming without spending a fortune, the Mangmi Air X is an easy recommendation from me. And that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.